Hello, everyone. I'm Dr.Christian Barrientos, Ichaso, international lawyer, anti-corruption, compliance. And now we continue with this podcast. How every weekend we continue with Martin Arostegui. He's a journalist. He was worked for America, Voice of America, Wall Street Journal, the Daily Telegraph, Washington Times, France 24, and United Press International. And he's author of the book Special Force. He worked with this book. He's author. Twilight Warriors. It's very interesting book, and you can buy by Amazon. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Christian. How are you? Good morning. We have a lot to talk about today. Basically, I'm devoting I'm going to do, I think, the whole, our entire podcast on this case I've been following about the Iranian Boeing 747 cargo jet operated through a Venezuelan state-owned charter company that's been grounded in Argentina for almost a month now due to its past gun-running activities for Hezbollah, for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. I've said that it represented the tip of an iceberg of a far larger Iranian-Venezuelan operation in Latin America, and latest developments appear to bear this out. Last week, 8 Chilean senators requested an official investigation into a similar airliner of Iranian origins, which had made 5 round trips between Santiago and Caracas this year. It's operated by the Venezuelan charter airline Coviasa, which is under U.S. sanctions over its services for the regime of President Nicolás Maduro, and whose cargo branch, Emtrasur, operates the sanctioned Iranian airliner detained seemingly indefinitely in Argentina. The illegitimate Maduro regime relies on the Venezuelan state-owned airline Coviasa to shuttle corrupt regime officials around the world to fuel support for its anti-democratic efforts, said U.S. Treasury Secretary Stephen T. Mnuchin at the time that sanctions on the airline were announced back in 2020. The Airbus under license number YV3533 that last landed in Santiago on June 22 is not on the original list of over 30 sanctioned Coviasa aircraft published by the U.S. Treasury Department in 2020. Chilean congressional investigators, however, have determined that the plane has been leased to Coviasa by the RGC's, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps' paramilitary airline Mahan Air, which also provided Venezuela with the Boeing 747 under investigation in Argentina. So we're talking about a concerted effort here. It's a very large, it's a wide-scale effort by Iran. I'm told that Mahan Air has just leased another Boeing to Coviasa, presumably to replace the one stuck in Argentina, which would indicate to me that the Iranians are really serious about continuing the volume and frequency of these flights. They don't want to let up on it. They're not going to let some sanctions being applied in one country in any way, set them off course. They want to continue the volume of these flights, of this, this air bridge that they're starting from Venezuela to other Latin American countries. Increased pressures on Coviasa make this difficult. The airline announced last weekend that it was suspending flights to Chile, Argentina, and possibly other countries because the application of U.S. sanctions, which blocked them from being refueled. In Argentina, for example, the national oil company, YPF, refuses to service the Iranian Boeing for fear of being delisted from the U.S. stock exchange. Future flights in Chile may encounter similar obstacles. So there's no way that they can get these planes refueled in countries where the U.S. and local authorities are managing to track the origins of these flights. The only way I would imagine would be to use, military. They'd have to use the military to to bring fuel to the aircraft, but that would entail a lot of other problems. And maybe the military would not agree. That would entail a direct state-to-state clash with the U.S. It's reassuring to know that there's at least one part of the world where sanctions against terrorist states appear to be working, right? So let's have a look at what the Chileans have found out about these flights. The government of recently elected left-leaning President Gabriel Boric has responded to questions raised in Congress by admitting that the Coviasa Airbus previously belonged to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Mahan Air, but that it was otherwise doing nothing illegal. It landed in Chile with 89 passengers, mostly Venezuelans, no Iranians, according to the government. They all went through passport control and customs inspection without a problem. The plane embarked about 100 passengers for the return trip to Venezuela, and everything seems fine. Chilean lawmakers investigating the case, however, including the chairman of the Congressional Committee on Defense, have a different take. They have remarked that the amount of bags, the amount of luggage on board the aircraft was way disproportionate to the number of passengers, averaging 5 bags per passenger coming into Chile. They have also produced a list identifying 7 of the passengers and crew as members of Venezuela's government and military who have conducted various personally assigned duties for President Maduro and one of his ministers most closely linked with Hezbollah. We're talking about Tarek al-Aissami. They include senior members of Venezuela's ruling PSTV party. These are some of the passengers on board and crew on board this Airbus that went to Chile, all carrying diplomatic passports, as well as Venezuelan Air Force officers linked to Maduro's military intelligence service, DGCIM, with records of past travel to Iran, Russia, and Cuba. 2 of them merit particular attention. The holder of Venezuelan passport number 8791872 and presumed pilot of the Airbus served as a personal pilot and escort for President Maduro, as well as for his former vice president, interior minister, and economics minister, Tarek al-Aissami, indicted by the US for laundering drug money for Hezbollah. The same Airbus that landed in Chile on June 22 was used by Maduro to fly to Iran on his most recent trip there last May. In other words, just weeks or perhaps even days after it returned to Venezuela from Iran, in what was a very high-level sensitive mission, the plane was flying to Chile with some of the regime's most trusted operatives. Another presumed crew member on the flight with Venezuelan passport 14312154 is also alleged to be a member of Venezuela's military intelligence involved in moving around members of Venezuela's Lebanese community, and has also served as a pilot and escort for Tarek al-Aissami. Now, this is interesting about the Coviasa crew's past operations in flying members of the Venezuelan Lebanese community, because this fits in very well with what a source in Argentina, a former member of the intelligence service, says has been going on in Argentina for years. The former high-level counter-terrorist official says that he recalls efforts to smuggle in large numbers of Lebanese financed by a local jihad businessman connected with Hezbollah money laundering rings in the Triple Frontier region with Brazil, Bolivia, and Paraguay. It's the same sort of network used to smuggle in Hezbollah terrorist teams that blew up the Israeli embassy and AMIA buildings in Buenos Aires during the 1990s. Okay. Argentine identification documents and funds were provided to the entering Lebanese to set up various businesses involving food preparation and catering, restaurants, export, import, and retail establishments to form bases for Hezbollah sleeper cells. The source tells me that a lot of them also went on from Argentina into Chile. This is actually very similar to methods used historically by the Italian mafia and other international criminal organizations to establish bases and penetrate societies all over the world. I mean, they launder money into restaurants and all kinds of small businesses, which serve as a front for their operations, for their criminal operations. and for them to move their their hitmen and their operatives around. My source says that some of this Hezbollah human trafficking operations were broken up in the past because the Argentine intelligence services raised red flags when they detected the terrorist and criminal backgrounds of some of the individuals. The current government in Argentina has blocked the intelligence services from performing such a task. They are no longer allowed to check on foreigners being granted nationality or any kind of documented status. They can't do it anymore. The source explains that establishing a Hezbollah infrastructure throughout Latin America requires moving around a lot of personnel, money, equipment, electronics, and possibly arms. The Iranian-Venezuelan flights are supposed to accelerate what he describes as a logistical system, a term also used by the FBI to classify the intensified air traffic branching out from the Iran-Venezuela air hub to other Latin American countries. Excuse me. Chilean and Argentine members of Congress, as well as Paraguayan and Brazilian authorities who have been investigating the case, go further. Argentine lawmakers Gerardo Milman and Christian Ritondo have said that the personnel and equipment transported on the Iranian-Venezuelan flights are for purposes of establishing a secret, non-official base to conduct tasks of cyber intelligence with the objective of gathering, processing, and organizing local and international political information to manipulate the information and produce disinformation. This is what the Argentine congressmen have said. According to the congressional sources in Argentina, 2 crew members of the Boeing currently detained in Argentina, including its co-pilot, are members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Special Operations Branch, or Quds Force, which manages Hezbollah networks. The president of Paraguay, who has also been tracking these flights, even says that the chief Quds officer from the Boeing underwent plastic surgery in Cuba so as to alter his face for a new picture on his passport, in which he also appears with a slightly altered name. This has allowed the necessary plausible deniability for Argentine President Fernandez to publicly refute claims that there are Quds officers on board the aircraft. According to former Argentine security officials, the purpose of the intelligence operation being set up by the Iranians and Venezuelans might involve supporting a much anticipated power grab by current Vice President and former President Cristina Kirchner, a move that would encounter massive public opposition and for which he may not count with the full support of Argentina's national security services. In Chile, Boric might also be turning to Venezuela and Iran to support his bid for his push for a new socialist constitution in the coming months, which is being submitted to a referendum. And again, there's going to be a lot of opposition to this. Boric signed a memorandum of understanding with Venezuela to expand air traffic between both countries last April at a Santiago air show, when preparations were starting, when he had when he had very recently assumed office, and preparations were underway, began to get underway to submit this new constitution, or a new constitution, to a national referendum. Some news editors I work with say that much of this is just conjecture. We don't know for sure what is on the flights, except for the cigarettes and auto parts and some of the manifests, and that some individuals among the passengers and crew may be Iranian and Venezuelan intelligence agents. Perhaps they're just traveling for a holiday or working second jobs. We don't know. But it's worth looking back at the role played by Iran and Hezbollah in consolidating the current regime in Venezuela to get an idea of what may lie ahead, or what they may be planning for other Latin American countries. Relations between Venezuela's far left and Hezbollah preceded the current regime. Influential lawyers of Lebanese and Syrian descent who went on to occupy key positions in the governments of President Hugo Chavez and of his successor, Nicolas Maduro, provided protection and asylum for Hezbollah terrorists during the 1990s who were accused of terror attacks in Argentina at the time. Chavez received the financial backing from Iran, as well as from Syria's Ba'athist Party, to mount his successful 1999 presidential bid. And no sooner was he in office than a lot of Middle Easterners, mainly from Syria and Lebanon, began arriving in Venezuela. High-ranking officials running Venezuela's immigration service told me at the time that they were under orders to process Venezuelan national identification cards for these individuals. They showed me a list of hundreds of such cases, and a list of thousands was later presented before a U.S. congressional hearing. Many of them were incorporated into what were known at the time as Círculos Bolivarianos, groups that acted as militia for Chavez, employing methods tested by Hezbollah in Lebanon that combine armed repression and ideological indoctrination with social services such as food distribution and even family counseling mainly in the poor neighborhoods. The Círculos played a key role in disrupting opposition mass protests through a highly studied method of pinprick shootings, okay? They did not have enough people to counter the protests with equally strong mobs. I mean, opposition protests back in 2002 when I was there were massive. I mean, a million people flooded the entire freeway that ran through Caracas, protesting some of the Chavez government's policies and moves to nationalize the economy at the time. They used gunmen on motorbikes to shoot into opposition marches, with the effect of dispersing them, because they would injure or kill maybe one or two people, and that was enough for everybody, for panic to take hold. The police would fire tear gas, and that was the end of the march. They did this in a highly systematic and consistent way throughout Venezuela, in what clearly became a form of state terrorism. None of the gunmen were ever caught or prosecuted, of course. It's worth following the trajectory of one particular Lebanese-born Círculo Bolivariano leader called Ghazi Nasreddin, who ran various businesses around Caracas, including a state lottery and a gymnasium. Excuse me. I visited the gymnasium, in which a life-size portrait of Chavez with a curved Islamic sword over it decorated the entrance. I was told by colleagues of Nasreddin that he was particularly fanatical and was training a special group in martial arts for use in maintaining internal discipline within the Círculos Bolivarianos. Detectives of the Caracas Metropolitan Police, who had his gym under surveillance, told me that it was frequented by young men who had recently arrived from Lebanon and who were suspected members of Hezbollah and other terror groups. They showed violent videos of their struggles in the Middle East with the usual triumphalistic Islamic and anti-Israeli propaganda inside the gym to Venezuelans that were being merged with these Hezbollah arrivals. With much of Venezuela's national security services coming increasingly under the control of Chavistas, the Caracas Metropolitan Police, controlled by the city's Christian Democratic mayor, was one of the few armed services on which the opposition could count for protection, and which could be counted upon to maybe act against this expanding state terrorist network, the Círculos Bolivarianos. So Nasreddin, together with elements of the army, undertook an operation to disarm the police, using selected members of the Círculos and some soldiers led by a mid-ranking officer, I think a major or colonel, to occupy and empty out its arsenal. I was told that the gym served as a headquarters for the operation, which needed to be conducted unofficially, and that a lot of the confiscated weapons ended up with the Círculos Bolivarianos. Nasreddin was subsequently promoted to important positions in the regime and given diplomatic postings to Lebanon and Syria. The gym was shut down One of its accountants said that it had always lost money and had been maintained by rolling loans from an Arab financier on Margarita Island, with very strong ties to Syria and Lebanon, where he conducted business with local banks. He had a lot of traffic with accountants in some Lebanese banks. He had also financed the presidential campaign of Hugo Chavez. When Maduro won elections universally denounced as fraudulent in 2015, Hezbollah chieftain Tarek al-Aissami became his vice president and interior minister, unleashing an unprecedented wave of repression, this time, of course, with the full support of the National Guard and the army, under the control of Cuban as well as some Iranian advisors who virtually ran the DGCIM. That became the center of control for the security services. So we have to ask ourselves, we need to ask ourselves, based on this past precedent, is this what Iran and Venezuela are planning on repeating in Argentina and other South American countries, in which elected leftist governments may try to impose repressive socialist systems to perpetuate their grip on power, like as in Venezuela? If Venezuela serves as an example, the answer is probably yes. And the Iranian-sponsored flights coming out of Caracas appear as channels to achieve this. The suspension of Cabillasa's flights announced over the weekend, thanks to the vigilance and growing awareness of a threat by authorities in some countries, may prove a spanner in the works. But unless there is a concerted effort to continuously expose and roll back Iranian influence in the region, it may come as too little, too late. Christian?
Yeah, we record this, we remember this investigate with AMIA, with the understanding Iranian threat across Latin America. Is constantly with prosecutor Nisman investigate the threat, Argentina threat with the deals with the Iranis, and now Chile is possibly a new threat. How Venezuela have a 20 years of this disagreement. Now, if Latin America is danger place for a state, or is continuing this incriminating position of Iran in these governments, regiments?
Well, I think the degree of influence that Iran has in Argentina is manifest. I mean, it's the fact of the matter is that we still the murder of Alberto Nisman. He was investigating a possible official cover-up of Iran's involvement in the 1994 AMIA bombings. It still hasn't been cleared up. In fact, even Macri, who preceded a conservative president who preceded Cristina Kirchner, did not move on the matter. And I remember I covered the assassination, the murder, the supposed what the government says was a suicide, for the Daily Telegraph when it happened. And I mean, there's very little question in my mind that it was a hit job. I mean, I think he was assassinated by an undercover team that had gained access to Venezuela with perhaps the assistance or the tolerance, the visto gordo of elements of the security services, and which at the time were under President Kirchner and Cristina Kirchner, and that they murdered him. And what is undeniable is that the Argentine intelligence security services in charge with its personal security, Nisman security, had lifted their protection the night in which it occurred. And actually, this is similar to what was happened in previous occasions. I was told, for example, by Argentine former intelligence officers that similarly, prior to the AMIA bombing, the security services had lifted their surveillance on possible Hezbollah targets in Buenos Aires, as well as their protection of Jewish centers, which were believed to be were threatened by Hezbollah. They were expecting an attack, and so they lifted all protection. The same is happening now, according to my source. They're now lifting their control over the granting of national documents to foreigners, to Hezbollah suspects. The security services are no longer performing that task. They're no longer checking the backgrounds of people being granted Argentine national identification, national identity papers. So we have there is clear collusion, there is clear influence, there is a clear body within the Argentine government, which is working for Iran. And the way that the President Fernandez has denied that there are any Iranian Revolutionary Guard agents on board those flights, and when evidence points to the contrary, is also indicative of the fact that they're aiding Iran in every which way they can without causing a direct confrontation with the United States. Not yet. It may come to that, but not yet. Fernandez has to go, in fact, to Washington the next few days to talk to Biden about Argentina's debt. So he's got to be a bit careful.
In your experience, has investigated journalists against terrorism, is it possible that Chile signed a cooperation agreement with Iran?
You're telling me if China is cooperating with Iran?
Chile signed a agreement with Iran.
Well, they signed, as I say in my report, they signed this memorandum of understanding to allow increased air traffic between Venezuela and Chile, which basically allows charter companies that don't have a regular air route to operate at a larger scale. That's basically what this is about. It clears the way for more flights, charter flights, to be made sort of at the last minute, outside the established air routes run by the regular airlines. So, yes, I think there is an element, certainly, again, in the Chilean government, which is probably is interested in expanding cooperation with Iran and with Venezuela, certainly.
The former minister of Argentina indicated that flights are denied. There's more flight at the night. Is no one on. Is more. Is why this no the public this news.
Sorry, Christian. I didn't quite get your question. A foreign minister of Argentina said that flights were denied.
Yeah, all these Iranian flights is on the night because they charge, but is not registered, not have a recourse in Argentina and Chile.
Well, a lot of the flights are recorded. You recall that in Bolivia was the same thing when a lot of flights started coming in from Venezuela after Morales assumed power. A lot of flights were not registered. These are military flights, mind. But yes, that's the point. These charter flights, these charter airlines can, at the last minute, decide to send a flight into a country based on, I suppose, on a pre-agreement to allow these kind of charter flights to enter. But the registration process is much looser. It's much less stringent, much more flexible. Which allows them to conduct a lot of covert operations. Of course, lends itself to that kind of use.
In covert operation, Iran's intelligence operation.
That's right.
Very interesting, dear Martin.
I'd like to, based on what we have here, I'd like to go back. I think it's worth mentioning. I've talked about this before. But I think it's worth mentioning a case which illustrates again the way that these networks being set up through these well, in this case, Lebanese people who are infiltrated seemingly to set up seemingly benign local businesses and so on, and family operations, family businesses at a small scale. How it's used in other, it's been used in other terrorist operations, including 9/11. We know, of course, that the Al Qaeda team that entered the United States to hijack the the three or four jetliners that were crashed into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and one which was supposed to probably hit the Capitol. Yeah, that was all right. That was a hit team entered for the purpose of doing this. That was a kind of paramilitary undercover operation in the typical sense. But there is evidence that a courier that was sent out to liaise with one of the teams, with the team that flew the American Airlines Flight 77 into the Pentagon, who was a Venezuelan passport holder by the name of Mohammed Al-Diab Fattah, Palestinian origin. He apparently came out, or he emerged from one of these. Supposedly his father was the owner of one of these Lebanese Islamic type, a restaurant or a food catering service in Venezuela, which provided kind of Islamic type food. It was something very innocent, very, very benign, seemingly very benign business operation. They sort of cut the chicken in a certain way and that kind of thing. And so supposedly that was the father, or that was the family business of this courier that was caught by the FBI in New Jersey, who had attended the flight school and was seen in the company of, and in discussions with, the Al-Qaeda team that crashed American Airlines Flight 77 on the Pentagon. He was deported from the United States on a visa violation. He'd overstayed his visa, with a request by the FBI to Venezuelan authorities. This was at the beginning of the Chavez regime. We didn't the awareness level about what the regime was doing was still very low. As far as the FBI and the U.S. Justice Department is concerned, they were still another friendly government. So they requested the Venezuelans to keep an eye on this guy, to question him, and keep some kind of surveillance on him. From the moment that he was put on board a Delta Airlines flight to Caracas, he disappeared from the radar. The Venezuelans say that he never re-entered Venezuela, and that is the end of the story. There's been no record of this guy ever again. I've heard. I looked into the matter. That he apparently was. Perhaps he may have been seen in Margarita Island or around some of the Arab-owned businesses, export-import businesses there. Perhaps, but that's it. He disappeared from the official radar. Obviously, his name was changed, his documents have changed, and we don't know. So this is how we don't know exactly what this guy was doing with the Al Qaeda team, but obviously he was probably providing some kind of support, and maybe who knows? Maybe he was going to be a hijacker himself. We don't know, and a wannabe. Maybe he was also going to, and he didn't go at the last minute for whatever reasons that they had. Maybe he was just too unreliable or something. So this is the kind of thing that these networks of Hezbollah connected or terrorist connected, in this case, we don't know if it was Hezbollah, small businesses provide. They provide a front for agents they maintain agents that can be activated at any moment to conduct or support a terrorist operation.
That's very, very interesting about how the financial, how is the network in this moment, Al-Qaeda team, and how is work with Hezbollah is continuing in Latin America interesting.
My conclusion, Christian, would be that I think Iran is very interested in developing this network, which, it involves Hezbollah at the grassroots level. And it actually involves, of course, Iranian advisors from the Quds and the elite Revolutionary Guard forces, also to operate at the government level. There are Quds officers, and there were a lot of Iranian military advisors now operating with the Venezuelans, including on their air defense system. And even in Bolivia, I was told by U.S. State Department officials that there was an Iranian team specialized in electronic intelligence and probably for electronic eavesdropping, operating directly with the presidential security unit around President Evo Morales, all right, along with the Cubans. They were currently operating together. So I think that Iran is interested in expanding, or is very interested, or it gives a certain priority in expanding its network in Latin America, both at the unofficial and the official level, to give it a base from which to conduct eventual ongoing terrorist operations into the United States. They have the Mexican border there wide open. There is massive travel traffic between the U.S. and Latin America, unrestricted for the most part. And yes, I think they're definitely interested in using Latin America to counter any U.S. moves, military moves the U.S. might make against Iran, the U.S. or Israel might make against Iran in the Middle East. So I think that's the purpose of this. And perhaps eventually to fuel a terrorist network to operate in the U.S. on an ongoing basis and against American targets in Latin America to totally expel the U.S. from the region. I think this is the long-term plan. And Iran seems to be very, very interested in this.
It's very, very interesting connection. Thank you, Martin, for continuing this podcast. Is your conclusion for this podcast? You remember?
My conclusion, I think I gave it. Well, what I always say in conclusion, what I always ask our audience is to please comment, support us, make any contribution you may care to make, get in touch. We need support. We need finance to continue our investigative journalism. It costs money, and your support is needed. We provide services that the rest of the media don't. And I think the kind of reporting we do is essential to understanding the threats that we face, the environment that we're in, both in Latin America and elsewhere in the world. So support us, contribute. Thank you very much. And as I say, we don't dwell in the conspiracies, but we don't deny that they exist. Thank you very much. See you next week.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you all. Subscribe and color with this podcast channel. Please subscribe and comment. The comment is more important for the channel, for the YouTube channel. And share it. Think about international security. Thank you, Martin. See you next week.
See you next week, Christian.